So I've been wanting to make a video about vulnerable people for a while now, but once again I've been putting it off for various reasons. I really wanted to appear on camera for this last video because I'm going to be talking a lot about my brother Jay, and I wanted to put my real face to it, but this will have to do. But anyway, vulnerable people. You could be forgiven for thinking that I don't care much about vulnerable people because of the way I've been going against lockdown and that I'm not taking the virus seriously. But I want to explain why that's not true. First of all, I took COVID extremely seriously when it first officially arrived here on the 28th of January. I went to the Brexit Party celebration on the 31st of January and I was nervous about it COVID then, but I thought I'd take the risk because I didn't want to miss the occasion. And I perhaps naively thought that seeing as how COVID had just landed in the UK, my odds of avoiding it was still pretty good. After that, I started to practice some light social distancing and started taking precautions. I stopped shaking hands with clients at work, stopped giving friends and family hugs and kisses, just little things like that. I would still see friends, but I tried to keep it to a minimum. I also started to avoid going into small, overcrowded places. I was pretty terrified of it at first, and I only got more terrified of it as more people got infected. I wanted to try and take it seriously, not just because of the potential threat to myself, but because of the threat to vulnerable people. If my older brother Jay was still here, I think he'd be one of the most vulnerable people you could find. For anyone that doesn't know, Jay died in May of 2019, 8 months after having a heart transplant. Now, if you know anything about organ recipients, you'll know that they have to take immunosuppressants to stop their immune system rejecting the new organ. This means they are particularly at risk from things like colds and flus. So a little while after lockdown began, I started to calm down a bit about the threat of the virus to myself personally. This is mostly because I changed jobs, from a job where I would be driving on my own, listening to the doom and gloom on the radio about the pandemic, to a job at a supermarket where I got to interact with everyday people and ask them what they think and hear their stories and theories. I was only in retail for a couple of months before I ended up back at my previous job, but it was honestly one of the most valuable and eye-opening experiences of my entire life. I started breaching lockdown to see some of my friends, and I can remember thinking that I was lucky to be in a position where I could breach lockdown and take risks. I'm privileged enough to be quite a healthy person. My family were considerably less concerned about the virus than I was, so they weren't bothered, and I didn't have to worry about bringing the virus home to a vulnerable person. But once I realised that the only reason I was in this privileged position is because Jay died not even a year before COVID arrived, I started feeling extremely guilty. I realised that the only reason I was so lucky was because my brother had died, and I felt almost like I was betraying him by breaching lockdown. It twisted my head up for a little while. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to realise that actually, I'm kind of glad Jay isn't around for this, and I'm going to explain why. But to explain why, I first need to briefly explain Jay's story. Jay had developed end-stage heart failure out of seemingly nowhere towards the end of 2014. Shortly after Christmas that year, he had a major heart attack at the age of 24. He was on life support in Harefield Hospital for a number of weeks, maybe even months, I think. Once he eventually started coming round, he'd been on life support in an induced coma for long enough that he'd lost the ability to do everyday things like walk, eat and drink, which he had to relearn. He made quite a quick recovery though, which I honestly expected him to, as he was one of the most determined fighters you could find. He made it out of the hospital on the 2nd of April, my younger brother Sam's birthday. So he was in Harefield for about 4 months the first time around. He was able to lead a pretty normal life after that, except now he had to live with the assistance of a device called a left ventricle assisting device, or LVAD for short. And so you know how the LVAD works. Here's a video of Jay himself explaining it when he was at the organ donor stand at Eastbourne's Airborne.
We also have, and I'm just hoping you won't mind me saying hi. Would you mind me saying, do you want to say hi?
Hello, you're right.
And this is Jay, and Jay's currently waiting for a heart transplant.
Yep.
Jay, do you want to just tell us about your, hopefully I can get this, probably jumping about all over the place.
Right, I'm currently on the list for a heart transplant, and in the meantime I've had a artificial heart implanted 3.5 years ago. The artificial heart, if we can get it in the shot down here, this is the external pack to my machine. This runs out of the bag into my waist here, which runs up to my heart and is basically powering my heart. And it's the bridge from being a patient to the transplant.
So as you saw from the video, he had to carry that device on him which battery powered his heart for nearly 4 years. He had to constantly worry about his batteries being charged until they finally found a new heart for him thanks to a very generous and brave donor. He went in for the transplant in September of 2018 and he pulled through the transplant, but just barely. He was back on life support in an induced coma again and hooked up to like 5 different machines, but this time the LVAD was gone. Slowly but surely he recovered enough to have the various machines removed, and they eventually brought him around from the induced coma. Once again he'd been in bed for so long that he would need to relearn again how to walk and eat and drink. He was still fighting the good fight and doing well, but he was noticeably more demoralised this time around. And who could blame him? He had to go through the same gruelling process of recovery that he went through 4 years before. Only I think this time it was even harder. He did manage to eventually make it out of hospital, but only briefly before he got called back in for one thing or another. He did make it out though, which I still think is an incredible achievement considering what he was up against. But he took a turn for the worst and his health deteriorated pretty rapidly, and he died on May 11th, 2019, 8 months after receiving the new heart. We had the funeral at the local crematorium, and I think somewhere between 200 and 300 people turned up. We had the wake at our pub afterwards, and it was the busiest I'd ever seen it by a long, long way. Everyone was pretty much shoulder to shoulder. Now I'm going to explain why I'm glad he's not here for all of this, and even just saying it like that makes me feel horrible, but I think it's the truth. As I said, Jay was pretty demoralised after the transplant because he had to go through the recovery process all over again. The one thing we continually told him in order to try and pep him up a bit is that he'd be able to get back to normal even more so than when he was on the LVAD. But of course, at the time, we weren't aware of the new normal that was heading our way. So let's imagine that Jay had survived and made it out of hospital at the end of 2019. Now put yourself in his shoes for a minute. You've just had a heart transplant. You've spent a consecutive year of your life in a hospital bed, wired up to all kinds of machines. You've had to relearn to walk and eat. You've had doctors and nurses picking at you. Injections, antibiotics, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, infections, cannulas, bed sores, physiotherapy, further operations, sleepless nights, and all sorts of other side effects from the amount of drugs you're on. Bearing in mind this isn't the first time you've had to do all this. You're feeling demoralised and depressed and lonely, and your family are trying to reassure you with promises of normality once you get out of the hospital. You finally get out of hospital and look forward to being able to resume your life after one of the toughest years imaginable, and then a couple of months later, boom, lockdown. How do you think you would feel? I mean, I struggled with lockdown as it was. I couldn't even begin to think of what that must be like. To have your dream of just living a normal life again, which you've been fighting so hard for, go straight down the toilet because of something totally unforeseen and not necessarily anything to do with you. I'm sure it would have been the ultimate demoralisation for him. Or maybe the ultimate demoralisation would have been for him to watch the repulsive way that everyone has turned on each other since. And by the way, that's if he would have even survived until lockdown. We suspect that we all had COVID in December, before anyone had even heard of it. we probably would have unwittingly given it to him. I was with Jay holding his hand when he died, and he died pretty quickly, and it seemed to be painless and quite peaceful. He used to have to get the nurses to move him around in his hospital bed all the time because he could never get comfortable, but he finally found a comfy spot not long before he went. I remember the nurses came in and said it was time to change his position, and I insisted that they leave him where he was because he just finally got comfy, which they did. He died probably not even an hour after that. I'm obviously still devastated that he's gone, and I think about him every day. But if it was his time, I'm glad he went the way he did. Now, contrast that with what would have happened if he got COVID during lockdown. He would have still had to routinely visit the hospital for checkups, so total isolation wouldn't have been an option for him. Imagine for a second walking into a hospital as a person with a suppressed immune system, knowing that any surface you touch or any person you walk past could be the one that eventually kills you. Like walking into a death trap. Imagine the stress and panic that must cause someone like that. If Jay had contracted COVID during lockdown, I imagine he would have been taken away from us. We wouldn't have been able to speak to him or see him, and he would have died on his own after going through so much to get his life back. And I'm sure it would have been a lot more painful and unpleasant than how he actually died. Imagine how that would have affected us, having Jay taken away from us with no warning, not being able to see or talk to him, and eventually just receiving a phone call telling us he died. And then having a bare minimum socially distant funeral. Imagine how that would have made me feel, given that I'm already at my wit's end with this pandemic as it is. I imagine I would be 100 times worse. Imagine how I would have felt if his funeral had been like this.
It's my privilege to have been asked to conduct our service today to celebrate the life of Alan Wright. I therefore offer you all a very warm welcome as we unite in love and friendship to...
You have to put the chair back, I'm afraid. You can't move the chair to its old.
Sickening. And imagine how it would have made everyone who wanted to come to the funeral feel too. Jay was loved by so many, and that's why so many people turned up to his funeral. That's why I say I'm glad he went the way he did, because I don't think I'd ever be able to get over the injustice of it if he had died of COVID during lockdown. The injustice is bad enough as it is, with him dying after being so close to making a proper recovery. Never mind if he went the way I just described. This will have been the reality for some people under lockdown, which we've just gone back into. And that's why I'm dead against it, and I want to try and do anything I can to wake people up to it. I'm going to explain another reason why I'm against lockdown. I made the point before in my end lockdown video, but I want to reiterate it here. One of the other things I've been struggling with in making my mind up about lockdown is, would I still be against it if Jay were here? I do my best to not be a hypocrite, and I try to make my opinions as consistent as possible. And so I like to think that I'd still be against lockdown if he were here, but I honestly can't say. I don't have a crystal ball or a what-if machine, so it's entirely possible that I would be in favour of lockdown if Jay were here. I'm not sure whether Jay would have been in favour of it or not, and I don't want to try to speak for him because I can't. But it's entirely possible that Jay would have been against lockdown himself, even though he would have been one of the most vulnerable people to COVID. In my end lockdown video I said, imagine if you had been given 6 months left to live on the day before we locked down. How would you feel? Just to give you an idea, you would have died 6 weeks ago if that was you. You wouldn't have been able to do much with the remainder of your life given the restrictions. The reason I made that point is because it hopefully will make you realise that time is precious and the ability to do what you want to do with that time is important. The ability to live your life and take pleasure in the everyday thing is important, as Maureen Eames from Barnsley reminds us.
I think it's all ridiculous. We should never have been in lockdown. All the people who are vulnerable should have been helped and kept on safe, and all the rest of us, I'm 83, I don't give a sod. I look at it this way, I've not got all that many years left of me, and I'm not going to be fastened in a house when the government have got it all wrong. We need, how can we get the country on its feet, money-wise? Where's all the money? By the end of this year, there's going to be millions of people unemployed, and you know who's going to pay for it? All the young ones. Not me, because I'm going to be dead.
I'm going to bring it back to Jay again. Because of the LVAD machine he was on, he obviously couldn't be fully submersed in water, which means he couldn't have a proper bath or shower for nearly 4 years. In fact, over 4 years if you include the time post-transplant. Imagine that. Imagine not being able to have a regular bath or shower for that length of time. I'm a smelly bastard at the best of times, but that would be a nightmare even for me. That's what Jay had to live with. One of the things we used to try and pep him up with in hospital is by saying that when he gets fit, he'll be able to have a nice bath again. Again, the pleasure of everyday activities. Things most people take for granted, including myself. But on top of that, Jay was an avid swimmer before he had his heart problems. He used to go to Eastbourne Beach and swim pretty much the entire coast of Eastbourne and back. Now, I don't think it was advisable for him to go swimming because of his suppressed immune system, but I know he would have wanted to because he loved it. Now imagine you're a police officer guarding the beach at the height of lockdown. One might wonder why you're not doing more important things than guarding a beach, but we'll leave that to one side for now. Imagine Jay comes up to the beach and insists he wants to go for a swim. You say no, you can't let him in because of COVID, and he tells you his story. He tells you everything I just told you. What would you say at that point? If you still say no, you can't let him in, ask yourself why. And think about what kind of person that makes you. Do you think you know what's best for him? You couldn't even begin to empathise with what he's been through, and therefore couldn't begin to imagine what's best for him. And to whose benefit would you be denying him that swim? Certainly not his. He's aware of the rules of the pandemic game better than most, and he's accepted the risk. Ask yourself why enforcing pointless rules is more important to you than doing what you know to be right. If you answered yes, that you would change your mind and let him go for a swim, well, congratulations, you've just invalidated the entire lockdown, because you've realised that people should be free to make their own decisions and take pleasure in day-to-day life and do what they want with their time, even if that means putting yourself at considerable risk. Because let's imagine instead of going swimming, Jay wanted to have a party celebrating his achievement, or go to a concert, or to the cinema. Party, concert, cinema. 3 things which at this rate the next generation will never experience. Those words are part of Old English now. Which, by the way, in hindsight makes me glad I went to the Brexit Party celebration, as it was one of the last ever legal mass gatherings, and the atmosphere was incredible. Whatever Jay may have wanted to do, no matter how big or small, if he wants to do it and everyone is aware of the risks, which literally everyone on the planet is aware of the risks now, who are you to interfere? It's hard to say whether Jay would have wanted to defy lockdown or not, but I can tell you it's totally feasible that he would have wanted to take a risk, and even if I disapproved, I wouldn't be able to argue against it. So to go back to the question, would I still be against lockdown if Jay were here? I think the answer is yes. Lockdown has been a trade-off. We've traded mental health away for physical health. Now, for some people, lockdown isn't such a big deal. I actually really enjoyed it at first, because I enjoy my own company anyway. I loved going out during lockdown for walks on my own, because the only thing you could hear for miles around were the birds. I loved how eerie the silence was too, like the silence you get when it's been snowing. And when all you could hear was the birds, it was almost like being in the jungle. But that was until isolation started to set in and I started getting sick of my own company. That's when I realised that it wasn't worth the trade-off. Mental health and physical health go hand in hand, and if you harm one, you can expect to harm the other too as a result. But the thing is, vulnerable people can always shield. If you're that worried about the virus, you can shield. You can live a COVID-secure lifestyle. It might not be pleasant, but it's doable, and I know this because I did it early on when social distancing could have made a difference in slowing the spread. I didn't need to be told by Boris to do it because it's basic common sense. And by the way, most vulnerable people did the same anyway. My job involves me going into the houses of elderly people all the time, and I always ask them how they've been coping throughout lockdown. The majority of them tell me the same thing. We've been shielding since February, even though lockdown wasn't until March 23rd. However, if you're a mentally vulnerable person, how do you shield from depression? How do you live a suicide-secure lifestyle? If it's the new normal that depresses you, with all its arbitrary rules and laws, how do you get around that? One way is to break the law, and that's not something we should be encouraging. And you will be shamed and made to feel like a terrible granny killer for it too. That's why we shouldn't be forcing people to choose between following unreasonable demands or breaking the law, and we shouldn't be shaming people for living their lives. And if you force enough people to break the law, chances are it's because the law itself is unreasonable. And if the law is unreasonable, people lose faith in the system, and that faith can be very hard to restore. And once people lose faith in the system, they're likely to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, you know what, fuck it, I don't care anymore. And I know this because this is where I'm at right now. I have no idea why I bother getting up to go to work every day. It seems like a struggle that's not worth it, both because I get no reward out of it, and it looks like the economy is going to implode anyway, so what's the point? Of course, there is another way of opting out of the lockdown and the new normal, but it's not ideal. In fact, it's pretty tragic, I'd say, but some people will still choose it over lockdown. People like 14-year-old Sam Tyler, whose mum claims he wouldn't have hanged himself if school hadn't been cancelled due to coronavirus. Shouldn't that read due to lockdown? Coronavirus didn't close the schools, government policy did. Government policy designed to protect vulnerable people. But wasn't Sam Tyler a vulnerable person? Why do we only consider people vulnerable to COVID as vulnerable people? What about people vulnerable to lockdown? And is it me, or has anyone else noticed that mental health has barely been spoken about by the government since the start of the year? Could that be because they'd have to acknowledge that it's their oppressive lockdown conspiracy theories that's doing damage? Do we need to wait until we have a suicide epidemic? Or should we take preventative measures and act now by getting rid of lockdown and letting people live their lives? Speaking of vulnerable people, what about all the people who depend on the NHS and have been let down? Are they not vulnerable people too? People like Kelly Smith, 31, whose chemotherapy was paused for 3 months because of COVID. I imagine her 6-year-old son won't be too happy with the country when he's old enough to understand the absolute farce that was the lockdown. That's if we're out of it by then. Or how about the people vulnerable to addiction? People like James Tucson, who'd had a problem with alcohol all his life. His mother, when informed of his passing, reportedly said, "I am not surprised. His alcohol intake has gone up so much since the start of lockdown." James, by the way, was one of around 8.5 million people in the country who are finding themselves high-risk drinking, which is almost double the amount of people in February. Just to really nail the point, I'm a physically healthy person, and so I'm not so worried about the virus. I have more to worry about with regard to my mental health, and further restrictions only makes it worse. Why should someone else's physical health trump my mental health? Especially considering physically vulnerable people can choose to shield. What choice do I have to safeguard my mental vulnerabilities from lockdown? And the virus is a force of nature, or a lab, depending on what you think, but the lockdown is a decision. One we can't change, the other we can. Jay would have fallen into the physically and mentally vulnerable categories. He might have decided to prioritise his mental health over his physical health, and I would have defended that decision and been very angry with anyone who stood in his way. Just like I'm angry when people try to stand in my way when I go about looking after my own sanity by trying to live my life. In my view, imposing restrictions on mentally vulnerable people is as bad as pushing a physically vulnerable person into a crowded room with no PPE and locking the door. Finally, it might not even be in the interest of physically vulnerable people to impose restrictions. I believe we must have some level of immunity to the virus, otherwise we'd be seeing reinfections around the globe, and you know the media would be ramming it down our throats every 10 seconds. Maybe that immunity only lasts a year. Well, in that case, the last thing vulnerable people would want is to stagger infections by imposing restrictions. The way around that problem would be to let the physically healthy people do what they want and spread the virus amongst themselves, while the physically vulnerable people shield. That way the virus would burn itself out until immunity wears off, and physically vulnerable people would be able to go out in public with less risk of encountering an infected person. And it would also address the mentally vulnerable too. If the immunity only lasted a year, we could time it so that we had COVID season, or shielding season, depending on which way you look at it, for say 3 months, build up herd immunity, deal with the demand on the NHS in one hit with COVID hospitals like the Nightingale Hospital, and once it's all done, let vulnerable people re-enter society with less risk than with restrictions. That's how you live with COVID. Of course, we won't know until we start seeing mass reinfections how long immunity lasts. And there's always a chance that by locking down and extending the time the virus has to infect people, we are also extending the time the virus has to mutate. We may be paving the way for a new strain, and we'll have to go through all this all over again. So that's why I'm still against lockdown, because I care about vulnerable people, just in a different way to everyone else, and different kinds of vulnerable people. I think it's time we think about the people who are vulnerable to things other than COVID. People who are vulnerable to depression or addiction or cancer or poverty. Vulnerable people should be considered as people who need society's help, not just people who are vulnerable to COVID. And by the way, that's why you shouldn't assume that someone who is anti-lockdown must be a selfish or bad person or a granny killer. That's why you shouldn't judge other people's behaviour before you know their reasons. It's not enough to just know what someone thinks, you also have to know why they think it.